All right. I hope everybody can hear fine now. Okay. So, panel, it's important to understand a few things in today's debate. First, the trend.
I can hear him now. Yeah, thank you.
Was that a problem?
No, Michael, go ahead. Thanks.
All right. It's important to understand the Chinese model and how there is a gradual and progressive transition from what we have known China to be, with that hegemonic communist state where the state actually taking over everything and controlling the entire economic structure in that particular regard. What we have seen gradually is China trying to empower its private corporations. So, for example, we see China today being interested in creating billionaires. We see China today being behind its private corporations and dominating the global economic space. So that is the model that progressively China has been taking in particular in today's debate. So that understanding is important. But secondly, on the issue of bonds, the issue about we coming to a state where there is a conversation about default is often characterized by companies which become insolvent, is characterized by companies which are not more profitable in their working models, is characterized by companies that are not pragmatically very economically viable to be able to deliver the kind of returns that we think they are able to bring. So the alternative or comparative in today's debate is very simple. And that is to say that the state has to bail these companies out or allow them to default. We'll show you two things from our world, from the world of opening government, why we think it is okay for the state not to bail these companies out, how it works economically, and secondly, how that in itself, a redirection of the money that could have been used to bail out these companies can be redirected to push out other private corporations or push other agenda that would help again in that particular regard. But then another thing that we are also more interested from opening government in today's debate is the interest of the CPP, the Communist Party in China, in that particular regard. So what is their extreme interest? We think that this is a party that has thrived on a narrative of strong economy. The Chinese Communist Party has been able to create dominance and hegemony and be able to sustain power based on the fact that it is economically viable. That fundamental of economics is important. So to the extent that we show you in today's debate that embarking on reckless bailout for companies that are not solvent, that do not assure any utility in terms of economics, would particularly endanger their economic strength, for which that is really important for them. We show you that and we win today's debate. So let's look at Chinese corporations and how this model play out in international optics and all of those things. So the seeming trend of Chinese corporations that we've seen are ones that are able to get state backing and support to be able to dominate on global scenes. We've seen, for instance, companies that the state has stakes in them. We've seen Alibaba among others. Okay, so these are the models that are increasingly becoming more successful on a global space as compared to purely government-owned owned companies, which in this particular narrative are not particularly economically profitable, for which they're insolvent. Okay, now making an attempt to bail out these failing corporations with money, what that means is that the government pushes money that could have been redirected in creating sustainable economic frameworks for other companies to succeed into failing companies which are likely not going to be profitable in that particular regard. But we think that even if government is able to be successful in bailing out these companies and all of that, we think the level of success that the track record of these companies give, owing to the fact that one, they are government-owned corporations. Being government-owned corporations means that they do not have the peculiar nature and environment that private government-backed companies have. So, for example, companies that appear purely private but have state backings, for example, Alibaba, they are able to thrive on international space and dominate global markets because, unlike purely Chinese-owned corporations that politically people can tag them as this is a Chinese company and they face a lot of challenges, a redirection of these funds to support those private investments would be more beneficial when it comes to competitive global advantage in that particular regard. This is a clear option that government has. Do you redirect the money to create an environment for private industries to thrive and the state also benefit, or you pump them into state corporations which, one, have shown failing signs and are not probably going to be profitable? But then even if you are able to resurrect them, we think they do not have the kind of prospect that those private corporations that you could have supported have in that particular regard. And so that's a very important argument. Before then, I'll take you. POI, yeah, go.
Yeah, so I think there's a bit of misinterpretation here, because the motion says that CCP should allow them to default. Allowing them to default means not having to pay the debt back. So it is your side which has to defend the state supporting failing businesses even when they fail by allowing them to default on a debt rather than repaying it.
Oh, we think that the comparative in the debate does not necessarily mean that allowing them to default means that the state, allowing them to default means that the state has to bail. The alternative to that is the state has to bail. That's not the kind of understanding that we get in today's debate. We think that the option is to allow them to default on those bonds, or you bail them out. So we don't think we are supposed to defend an issue of the state bailing them out in that particular regard. You allow them to default or you bail them out. That is it. Yeah, you can come again if you don't have an understanding of it.
Yeah, so the question of bailing out and the question of allowing to default are separate ones. Allowing them to default means that they don't have to repay a current debt. So that's what you have to support. I don't think anyone on opposition will support bailing them out anyway. So that's not a debate we should be having.
Protected time.
Now you can choose to run away from that burden. That's a burden that you can choose to run away from, that you do not support the state bailing them out. But what fundamentally we think that allowing them to default comes with a lot of consequences. So for example, those people who own the bonds in those companies could take over the companies and privatize those companies. They become private models, and government in turn can be able to push them in a way that we told you. Okay, so if the comparative is this: if you allow them to default, what happens when those companies default? We think that when you allow them to default, those private people who have their money locked up in those bonds have the equities and they'll be able to take up those particular companies. We think that to a large extent, even if it gives you that point, it could lead to a possible privatization of those companies, because those people who own the money that the companies defaulted could be able to take over. We are not in support of the fact that government should be able to bail them out. So that's not the comparative in the debate in itself. But then more importantly, we think that we opt in. Is my time over?
Yes, your time's over.
Wow. All right.
All right. We want to thank the Prime Minister for that speech. We invite the Leader of Opposition to give a speech not to exceed 7 minutes. And I do want to again bring attention to the debaters that there are protected times in which POIs are not allowed. So remember, between 1 and 6 minutes, you can add POIs. So
sure. Apologies for that. I think it's just that the speaker accepted, and then I assume we're still there to continue.
Perfectly fine. You definitely understand that. But in any case, we welcome the Leader of Opposition to open up the case for the opposition bench. Here.
Mic check. Am I audible?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, excellent. In 3, 2, 1. Panel, 3 contributions in opening opposition. 1, why the act of allowing somebody not to pay their debts will undermine the local markets and will create huge unbalances and fuck over the Chinese economy. 2, why it creates a bias that is an unfair one and that causes issues in external stuff in international relations. And thirdly, talking about the legitimacy of CCP and the government. For that clarification on what do we actually think that this motion stands for, we agree with Tudor from CO when they come and tell us that effectively this means about not being able, not just letting them off their debt, because the act of defaulting means that you do not pay your debts. The act of defaulting on your debts is effectively the act of, let me find the motion wording here. So it says that you allow the state-owned firms to default on domestic bond repayments. That means you allow them specifically not to pay the domestic debts back. We think on our side of the house, they have to pay the debts back. Oftentimes that will result in them maybe going under and not continuing business. But in some circumstances, that might not be the case. In some circumstances, we think that they will still continue the business. Note that this is a blanket policy, which means that given opening government, there's literally no model on how they're going to do this, that they're going to allow this in basically all scenarios. That means that the corporations that are government-owned can just say, look, I don't want to pay off my debts, meaning I'm not going to do it. I'm just going to continue my business without paying my debts. They have not made this conditional on there being some economic trouble or anything. We think that government firms and governments, when they have an interest to do this, are very good at generating excuses and so forth for there being financial troubles and faking economic material and so on, like they do in China, meaning we think it is likely to be overused even if they retrospectively attempt to come up with some mechanism to cure their problem. That we think means that it is not only used in the circumstances where the business could go bust if they did not pay the debts, and to the extent that it is used in those cases we're still winning, but it's also used in cases where they would necessarily not go bust regardless of that. Firstly, addressing the chance that these companies would go bust as a result of defaulting on the debts, meaning that they would not be able to pay their debts and so on. By allowing them to default on the debts, you are politely saving them from going bust. We are making them go bust because of the fact that they have to repay these debts to the domestic creditors that are asking for the debts from them. And that means that we are decide if this is the scenario that is limiting the number of government businesses and that is pushing towards the private sector, which is what opening government said that they stand for, meaning on that comparison we are winning this debate. We are focusing more also on the part where we think that these corporations are misusing this policy and effectively continuing still to operate. Firstly, on domestic corporate like stuff and why this fucks over the domestic Chinese market. We think that if it is that like government corporations are unable might get away by not paying their debts and might just still be allowed to continue operating in the market, that effectively allows them to get free money as a result of almost like a subsidy from the state. It means that they do not have to pay back what they have borrowed and they're still able to operate in the market. That gives them an unfair advantage in comparison to all the other corporations in the market because they're now able to invest more. They're effectively being able to steal free money from others if it is that they do not have to pay it back and are still able to continue operations. We think that creates a significant problem because it creates unfair competition and undermines the other companies, but also it creates perception problems in the market where it seems that is very unbalanced and somehow like not functioning. We think most importantly it creates problems for the Chinese banking system because presumably these corporations have loaned the money from domestic banks and those domestic banks are supposed to fund the entire system. At the point at which they're not forced to pay back all their money, but rather they're allowed to default, meaning allowed to not pay back on those debts to the banks. That means that the banks are incurring huge losses. We think Chinese banks are highly indebted at the point at which they have loaned a lot of money to US and also the huge amount of investments in China. What does that mean? That they are either one going bust or two having to increase their rates so much that they're able to make up for these losses by other like high rate loans that they're giving to people in China. That means that there is less investment because the loans are more expensive. There are less banks. That means that there is less economic growth in China. We think all of this is undermining economic growth and the private sector that proposition so dearly talks about. What is the problem that this results then for CCP? We think that what happens is that CCP is reliant on the general economic growth in China and the fact that they have a functioning investment system and jobs for countries for their legitimacy and for the fact that they are in power because they massively oppress their population and then they limit their rights and that is literally just on the grounds that they are able to bring them economic benefit. That is what keeps people happy in China, that they are able to have jobs and have huge economic growth. The moment you do not do that, it undermines the legitimacy of the party, raises grounds for more opposition movements and so on. Does CG have any POIs? OG?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure where the belief that we're always going to allow these defaults to occur really came from. Like, obviously, this would be done in contextualized instances where we believe that the company can recover. Like, that likely means that it's the context of economic shock and not just like failing companies.
Right. We think that your opening already said that the private sector is in general great and should be increased. We think that the more of these firms that go bust as a result of this, the more private. We think that is also the case specifically because there are certain benefits for having the private sector and giving them what the credit credit and the money and having them access to like money from the banking system and whatnot. That looks effectively things like the private sector being more resilient towards international sanctions, because the public corporations are the ones that are usually sanctioned. When you sanction CCP for the atrocities that they commit, you sanction the government and the parts of the government, including the corporations. You do not sanction the private sector and so on. We think that there are specific benefits, like the opening said, to the existence of the private sector. Secondly, talking about external issues and so on, we think that China is currently being pushed hard for having different rules for their own corporations. The moment that they're saying that, look, it's not only a regular state aid that we're giving to these companies, maybe in some circumstances, which is kind of internationally acceptable thing to do, but you're saying they have different rules in this game and they're allowed to pay, to effectively not pay their debts at all. That is obviously a much worse problem. That means that the perception of China being unfair and stealing jobs and so on that Trump relies on kind of makes things significantly worse. Does CG have a POI?
Yeah.
Okay, type. Okay, fine. No. Effectively, that then means that you're going to have far more sanctions from places like US. You're going to have far larger problems of China being seen as an unstable and bad country to invest in. Couple of problems for CCP. One, your country gets poorer, meaning your legitimacy goes down and your economy goes down, the more there are therefore people that are protesting on the streets. Secondly, we think that this results in things like the economy in general being seen as a volatile one. They're being stressed in the economy and so on, which means that stock prices in the Hong Kong Stock Exchange and so forth are likely to go down. We think that the Chinese government officials, as private individuals that formulate the CCP, and therefore their interest is part of the interest of CCP, are likely to have a huge amount of money invested in there and therefore make huge personal losses that are not in the interest of the CCP to incur. We think it means that there are less investors coming to China because they perceive the whole system as unfair, meaning you still get less economic growth and so on. Alone with the perception that you have a policy that the domestic companies are allowed to default, not contingent on whether it is used like CG tries to claim or like OG decided to. Lastly, on corruption and so forth, we think that it looks like effectively stealing money from private institutions and banks within China. It makes CCP look even more corrupt than it currently is, because you're not having the same rules for private corporations as you are for state corporations. We think that is something that is incredibly bad. It creates more opposition and it weakens CCP. Could not be prouder to oppose.
I'd like to thank the Leader of Opposition for that speech. We invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for the government bench.
I'm not doing the show for you.
Hello.
Oh, yeah, so
Yeah, go ahead. You're muted.
Opening government, you're on mute.
Hello. Hello.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the problem is that he's unable to get in at the moment, but he listened to everything that happened. I put him on call and he listened. So he's on a call and the sound is quite clear enough. I can just connect, then you listen to him speaking.
Okay, I think that's fine. I think that works. I think everyone's fine with that.
Okay. So I'm just putting it all on in a moment.
So I want to confirm if everyone can hear me, please. I want to confirm if everyone can hear me.
Yes, everyone can hear you.
Yeah, they can hear you.
All right, sure, great. I begin first. So, panel or panels, I want you to think long and hard about the word default, because what OO wants to do or how they characterize it, they are not wrong on as to what the word default means. But then, if you are looking at this from a purely economic lens, or at least from what my teacher taught me, you need to think about what happens after default. Most of the time, most of the time, what you realize is that is to file for bankruptcy to a point where they are able to have time to be able to seek for reinvestment into their companies and then be able to pay off those loans. What defaulting means is that you are saying, I cannot pay you or I cannot pay back your loans in that particular moment. As to how you move forward from there is what OG tries to make this debate about. It's not simply a case of I cannot pay you, therefore I still move on. because our characterization of the kind of companies that default was very, very important. We showed you that these are states or these are corporations that are non-performing. These are states, these are corporations that are not providing essential goods and services. These are companies that are not providing profit. So as to OO's imagination on how these companies default and all of a sudden are doing so well and can be able to do all of those other things is what we don't understand. Because then the way forward is that you need capital. That capital comes from a reinvestment from the state in terms of bailing you out. So when you allow a corporation to default, what you are saying is that you've reneged on your loans or on your commitments. The effects are mostly that you either liquidate and people will be able to gain back their principal, or you file for bankruptcy and be able to seek for further capital in order to drive people's investments and be able to pay back. The default example is much more expensive than what OO tries to make it. That's why how come when you default on your mortgage, the bank takes over the house. You do not own the house anymore. You don't say that because I've defaulted on it, I'm just sitting in the house, anything you want to do to me, come and do it. The debate is much more expansive more than that if you want to use a pure economic lens to do. And it's like maybe you just want to take their word for it. There's no way default simply means don't pay and sit down. Right? So the comparative clearly is that the CCP as the owner of the state or as the one that controls the state then is able to bail out most of these companies and allow them to be able to operate in order to continue in the long term. What we wish for on our side of the house are two things. First of all, if we default, we are okay with privatization. We show you why the benefits are important. But secondly, we are also okay with liquidation for people to be able to reclaim their principal and for the company to go away. We don't want anything to do with that company. We think it is still in line with our agenda to foster privatization within that economy. Default is much more expansive panels than what OO wants you to understand. Right? Let's move on. So what is necessarily the trade-off? You have money that is being pumped into a failing company that has no returns, right? We think that is in itself is unstrategic and is uncomparative to status quo, because in status quo, China engages in a number of things. It seeks to strengthen its private sector in order to aid its global domination, especially on the global economic front. So what it does is strategic investment in private corporations. For example, Huawei, Alibaba, Tencent. Secondly, what it does is to invest in foreign bonds to tilt the balance of trade in their favor. Thirdly, what it does is currency stabilization and manipulation to give their corporations a competitive advantage on the global field. Fourthly, what it does is strategic international investment, loans and grants, which give Chinese private companies leverage in countries where they go to. So they give loans to countries in Africa and suggest that their companies are the ones able to build up those roads and then like take the profits to themselves. Why is that beneficial? Because we think the state-owned corporations which are defaulting, which remember we've characterized as weak, do not return profit, offer poor services, are incapable of moving beyond the borders of China, in the sense that even for domestic services, they are unable to provide. Therefore, that means that the whole agenda of global domination cannot be done using state-owned corporations that are on the want to default or that are on the brink of a default or bankruptcy. The second thing we showed you is that it has a negative effect on the image of the CCP, especially domestically. So first of all, taxpayers realize that their money is continually used to bail out these companies to a huge degree. What that then means is that most of the time there's ineffective management within these companies, and because these companies necessarily reflect the state in as much as they are state-owned corporations, we think it has a negative effect on how the state is being viewed within China. We think that the state is viewed as weak and ineffective. So we think, one, on the optics front, we think it's going to fester rebellion against the CCP, which is definitely against our interests. But secondly, then we are unable to, or we fail to deliver on tangible services and goods which we have promised to the people. So the model which OO brings to us is largely uncomparative. So, for example, when Greece said it was to default, Greece said, I can't be able to pay back the loans. What we think it led to was that it was credit unworthy, etc. So the only way by which you can get these default companies where you can move from OO's world is when government is pouring back taxpayers' money into the companies in order to get it moving. That's how the only way by which default works. Default doesn't work by you saying, I'm unable to pay, and then you sit down, right? We think it doesn't work that way. So most of the arguments we get from their side are inference that we can make on that side. Because firstly, from a purely economic perspective, we show you that the legitimacy of the CCP is dependent on the economic benefits which they are able to give to people. Through privatization, we are able to create millionaires, a lot of millionaires and billionaires within the sector, which means that there's more creation of employment domestically. It means that even if this default leads to a private takeover eventually by shareholders, we think it opens the companies up to more investment even within the countries where they're able to employ much more people and provide jobs. It means on the comparative, we have the economic advantage. What they necessarily need to defend, is why the CCP should be able to step in and be able to take control over all of these companies and be able to portray itself like the aggressor that it is, and be able to stamp its authority, etc. What we are fighting for is the economic liberalization as pursued by the CCP. What they are supposed to defend is strict communist tendencies and procedures that seek to control the state in that regard. So on that front, you realize that such methods such methods which are being used are much more favorable on the international market than they are. We are more likely to receive investments on our side when we have private investors at the ones being leading or being at the forefront of most of these investments. I still have a feeling that I need to clarify this last thing before I leave. When you default, you are saying, I can't pay. So you either file for bankruptcy and ask for time to be able to pay
the time up. Okay.
Or whatever.
Rasmus, the time is up.
Yes. So default is much more expensive.
All right. I'm sorry he was unable to take POIs because he's not seeing anything that's going on. He's just speaking through a phone call. So sorry for no POIs taken.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you to the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech. We invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to close the top half of this debate here.
Yes, there is a computer problem. The Deputy Leader will speak from...
I just accidentally pressed the thing.
Okay, the Deputy Leader is rejoining us in 30 seconds.
Sure, thanks.
I don't like doing speeches like sitting down, so I transferred my computer and accidentally pressed something, so sorry about that.
It's fine, no worries.
So is it fine for me to start, just to check?
Whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you. So it would be incredibly clear at the point where you are not defaulting. That means you are not being kept up, right? If I'm allowed to default on my debts, that means I don't have to repay my debts instead of, for example, being forced to sell off properties and privatize them, etc. And do whatever I can in order to pay the people who lent me money. That is why we would say we agree wholeheartedly with most of the OG case, except for the fact that we think exactly because of the many things that they said and very well analyzed, we think that is a reason why you should not allow them to default, because those things will get worse on their side. So to start with some kind of explanation just in terms of how exactly this gets worse, and to add some mechanisms to the mechanisms we get out of LO and also from opening comments on why that's a good thing. So firstly, we agree with a lot of the analysis in terms of how a lot of state companies are failing to perform and are inefficient and kind of need to be controlled. We think that's exactly why the state allowing them to not pay like private lenders, etc., that often have like huge stakes invested in these companies, because they are often also like have been traditionally perceived, given the Chinese market is relatively like opaque, etc., internally have been perceived by people, including individual citizens, as safe investments. We think that from that like a few different hards, in addition to the ones we've already described, like are empowered by this analysis. Firstly, in terms of like domestic acceptance and support, a person like Xi Jinping has been able to gain massive legitimacy and support within China, and like relative popularity, especially at the start of his term, by being perceived as an anti-corruption figure, because a lot of the kind of resentments that people have within China about the CCP relate to the regime being perceived as corrupt and using governance to like fill its own pockets, whatever the English term for that is, right? So kind of we think at the point where the state is perceived as, taking private people's and private companies' money in order to subsidize failing state-owned firms. That is one kind of massive point through which you can galvanize the opposition. But we can already see the CCP is taking like huge strides and like having to quell physical protests with like police force, etc. We think that they're in a situation where you definitely don't want to like give them further reasons to protest and like further reasons that like can be used to kind of legitimize their claims against the CCP. We think in this particular political context, it's incredibly risky for you to start kind of doing things that can be like perceived as basically like funneling money to corruption, because to some extent, honestly, it might be as well. Secondly, economic competition within China. So we think like China is a huge domestic market, and part of why Chinese companies are able to compete, both like state-owned ones, state-affiliated ones, and relatively private ones, is because there is huge competition internally within China that leads to relative economic efficiencies and innovation. Because, for example, like Tencent, Alibaba, etc., WeChat, etc., are competing with each other, and then as a consequence of that, are innovating, especially given the like massive domestic talent pool and the fact that you have a lot of internal investment within China within these these companies. Note that is something that you want to preserve, and at the point where like private lenders are having their debts defaulted on, it is relatively harder, because like they are now perceived these investments as more risky for them to like access finance, as Jon has explained. But secondly, your international economic success can be undermined by the fact that you're using private money from firms that were or individuals that were successful enough to be able to make those investments in state-owned companies in order to kind of fund these failing state-owned companies. And we think that means that it's effectively you're crippling your economy to some extent. And I know that this doesn't need to be a huge economic harm, right? What is enough is that like part of the Chinese regime's legitimacy at this moment relies on the fact that the economy is like still growing, and like even a deceleration within that growth to some extent, we think is something that is a political risk too, especially when it's combined with all the perceptions that it has. Like, thirdly, in terms of like international factors, Jon has already explained to you that this is less able to like attract international investment. During like Chinese state-owned companies are perceived as politically nasty. They're like perceived as less efficient, as things that are like less less able to control them, etc., because they're state affiliated. And as a consequence of that, like relative to other kinds of companies, it's harder to get investment. But also like the more like China does these kind of policies that are very explicitly going against the private market and private lenders within China and for the state-owned companies, that is something that means that kind of investments in, for example, the Hong Kong stock exchange, etc., get riskier, like in terms of perception for like international investment. We think that is bad, because not only are you literally stealing money from the people who lend it to these state companies, you're also furthermore crippling like the ability of other private companies to access like financing within China. Furthermore, note that they Prop had no response to Jon noting that these are far more vulnerable to like external sanctions, given a lot of political risk, etc. CG, would you have a PY for me? Closing comment? OG?
All right. So look, the state is a different legal agent from the state's enterprise. So allowing them to default means that the state is deciding not to bail them out, but simply they're facing the consequences, whether it is liquidation, privatization, or whatever that it is. So that's something you should be able to concede to.
No. Just no, I already explained that start of my speech, so I'm not going to go into that again. Instead of what I'm going to do is I'm going to, if CG doesn't have a POI, I'm just pointing out, I really tried to take two, but I wasn't offered two, so I could only take one.
Sorry, I feel like the only discussion has been around like companies that are inherently going to fail. Like there are a lot of companies that are actually quite competitive that are state-owned, just not in the tech area. Like they don't have a competitor for WeChat.
Yeah. A few things. One, we think when it comes to like competitive state-owned companies, you are not in a position where you are like tending to default on your debts. Secondly, I want to know that when it comes to this particular POI that you had, Jona, for example, on kind of, state-owned companies that are basically worth rescuing, note that if there are exceptional circumstances in which you have a well-performing industry, there's say an international shock of some kind or a natural disaster or something, and they like legitimately are in a position where that is exceptional for them, you can in both circumstances support them via means that are not allowing them to like default on these domestic bond repayments. In which case you are forcing the cost of that on those lenders specifically. For example, you can offer them subsidies, you can offer them like lots of other things, you can give them like loans like as a state, etc., that allow them to pay back those and like do repayments without like going down. That is something that we're happy to do in the cases where this is legitimate competitive. There's a particularly good justification that we can sell to the people and sell to the markets, and then where the, for example, like this is like a strategically important industry or something. We think that this is the worst possible means of like trying to save them in the case where they're worth saving. We think in the cases where they're not worth saving, it's inexcusable. And like, given the state has failed to like keep them competitive, it's definitely on the state to repay if anyone is to pay. For those reasons, oppose.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for that speech. We invite the Member of Government to open up the back half of this debate here.
I do, for context, I do think they are coming. They just have to like switch to their phone. Yeah, I think they are.
No problem.
You are muted.
You're muted.
Member of Government, you're on mute.
Okay. No, sorry. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
We can hear you now.
Sorry about that. I was saying that I just had to switch to my phone for my thing because my computer just crashes every time I give a speech on my webcam. But I will get right into it. Panel, I think that what we need to do on the back half of this debate is do some critical reframing of what sort of industries are likely to necessarily need bailouts and what, need to be able to default on their debts, why this is better than bailouts or better than subsidies or better than loans or anything that the opening opposition necessarily spoke about in the last couple of minutes of their speech, and then also talk about why this is incredibly important for the legitimacy of the CCP and why it is much more preferable to the world that the opposition sets out. And before I go into my extension and my refutation, I'm going to just make something very clear in terms of our case line. I think that it is possible and it is necessary for the CCP to express a desire for the coexistence of a strong private and state-owned sector on the economic landscape. But even if we are to believe that it is necessary to transition to a privatized economic landscape that is more capitalist than communist in nature, I would tell you that it is still better to have this transition happen through the choice of the state to sell off state industries when they are profitable, as opposed to having them all default at once and be sold off for pennies when they are not profitable. I think that that is the comparison that we have to deal with. I think in the opposition world, what ends up happening is all state-owned industries oftentimes collapse at like very similar times, because usually the times that like these industries necessarily need this to default on debts are based on the fact that they are going through economic shocks that are usually rocking the entire nation as a whole. I think that's incredibly important. So I'm going to go into an extension. I will flag a lot of implicit refutation, and then anything explicit will come at the end. First of all, I think Navin already told you in her POI that there are a lot of industries that don't necessarily have a competitor within the private industry, which means to find a replacement would necessarily be for the state not just to transfer it over to a mass, like a majority of influx of lots of different private investors, but rather probably more likely to sell off to one specific monopolistic owner that would necessarily compete with the state. I think that if you are the CCP, that is not something that is within your preference, because I think that that necessarily means that private investors and private companies end up having just as much power within the state if they own like these industries that there is only a state-owned industry for. I would also tell you that the other ways that we're going to see this happen are in industries that oftentimes you see growth and like growth over long periods of time. So I mean things like resource extraction, things like innovation, and things like medicine, where oftentimes you have to incur losses in the short term to necessarily see long-term growth. I would tell you also that resource extraction is something that is uniquely an industry that is majority state-owned within China, and that if you see that resource extraction is not currently profitable in the short term, it is probably not a good idea, if we are to believe everything they told you about bailouts and loans and the legitimacy of the CCP and necessarily happening when the government is literally paying itself, it is probably not a good idea for year after year to be providing loans and bailouts to these industries that are not going to be profitable until years down the line. I would also tell you that these companies allows for these companies to weather economic shocks when it happens internally, like nationally and internationally. I would tell you, for instance, and a great example of this is, say, consider a global pandemic where a large amount of your workforce is suddenly unable to work all at once, which means that not only do you have less necessarily economic shocks, but you also have a huge amount of labor loss. And I think that when opposition tells you that the ways that people are going to sell off and pay back their bond repayments, they talk to you a lot about selling property. I actually don't think that's the first thing that a lot of companies do. The first thing they do when they are necessarily facing major economic losses is to lay off large amounts of their labor force, which means that when we're talking about the legitimacy and the incentives of the CCP, we are not incentivized in any sort of way to see massive amounts of labor loss all throughout the country, because several companies that necessarily are facing economic shocks can no longer deal with their labor. I'll take back.
Do you not think that for those companies that are well functioning, as you described, there are potential alternatives that we can do that don't involve us not giving any money to people that have already invested in bonds?
I'll get to that. Okay. So I think that there is the ability of the government, and I think that this is unique about bond repayments, is that there are a lot of state-owned industries that are necessarily like not going to be profitable right away. But there are also a lot of private industries that also have these bonds that are profitable, which means that I think the government is able to not necessarily dole out money to people that have these bond repayments, but to still create profit from the private industries that are able to pay that back. I think that that means that you actually still end up getting an influx of money even when there are shocks that ends up balancing your accounts, which is much more preferable than to doling out money and like indiscriminately. I would also tell you, and I think this is important going back to my point about labor, is that if we care about the legitimacy, number one, of the CCP, but also in terms of like riots and uprisings, and this is a lot about what opening opposition talked about, is that it is probably very, very harmful to see not only mass unemployment, but also mass migration to areas like Hong Kong for people who are now looking for jobs and looking for economic opportunity directly because of the actions of state-owned industries failing. Like, I think that is the most harmful optical wave to undermine the legitimacy of the CCP. If it's not only coming through state-owned industries failing, but also now massive unemployment, I think that they need to engage with the ways that this is actually going to harm the mass majority of the people, and not just like through like people not being repaid on their bonds. Why is this important? I think that if we are to see less amounts of layoffs and mass migrations for work, I think we are able to then ensure more legitimacy for the CCP. I also think that this still works in their world, and I'll take you in like 5 seconds. No, actually, I'll take you now. opening. No, sorry, I can't. I apologize. Okay, I think that this still works in their world where we want to see a transition to privatization. Because I would tell you, in a world that we want to see a transition to privatization, and we have now given them the ability to default on their loans, they are able to plan a transition to privatization at a much more gradual pace that doesn't necessarily mean that a company defaults all at once and necessarily loses all of its workers. I think it also means that you can probably see bond repayment or other investment coming in the future in a way because they don't necessarily have, they didn't lose everything all at once. I think that if we care about the legitimacy of the government, and I think if we also care about the long-term efficacy of these businesses and of having a labor force and of having a populace that is invested in the long-term existence of the CCP, then you have to propose. Thank you.
All right, we'd like to thank the speaker for that speech. We invite the member of opposition to continue the case for the opposition bench.
Can everyone hear me? Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
Sorry, okay. So, 1 second. Okay, great. 3, 2, 1, go. Panel, I'm going to start with 1 point of rebuttal to deal with closing government's case, and then 3 points of extension, which are both new and extraordinarily relevant in this debate. So, first of all, on rebuttal to CG. So they say essentially their case is as follows: there are scenarios where the crisis hits, you need to, and different companies might need to default at different times. You need to protect them. As Lucia hints to in a POI, we can do this in a variety of ways which do not require massive defaults and not repaying money ever. Because again, a default means that you won't have to repay it at any point because often that debt is forgiven. So what are some examples of of what we can do instead? First of all, closing government speaks a lot about people losing jobs. Government job programs and government job guarantee schemes for which the government offers you jobs are, if anything, a staple of the Chinese Communist Party, which it has created, which it has, been able to produce massively, right? In all of the crises it has faced so far, so, right, government jobs for people to not be unemployed in order to hire them, right? So they can do that. They've done that before as well. They can also do other things such as quantitative easing, right? Or, for example, buying specific toxic assets from corporations which are going down to protect them in the event of a crisis, right? Or even we would support them offering loans, right? It's fine for them to offer loans in particular moments of crisis, but the key is that when the economy bounces back up and these corporations bounce back up, these companies will have to repay those loans, right? So there will be no default on the loans offered during a crisis, right? Because then even when the economy bounces back, they won't have to repay you those loans. So we're happy to give them even loans, right, in moments of crisis, but with the key provision that they will have to repay them once the economy bounces back, rather than be able to default on them. So now, jumping on into substantive and 3 points of extension from CO. First of all, so I think opening opposition very beautifully and correctly identifies that allowing these companies to default will mean that specific companies which can't repay, right, mean that, they'll be able to outcompete other people, other entrepreneurs, right, will mean, less innovation perhaps, or less competition, right? But the problem is, I think, the impact of this argument is limited. It is an impact limited to the 1 or 2 companies which will have to let default at one time or another, right? Which probably limits the impact in terms of, just how much all of the country will be affected by sort of entrepreneurship falling down, right? I think it's quite limited because 1 or 2 companies will default at one time. The far larger impact, we tell you from closing opposition, is the signaling effect this will have, and how that signaling effect will skew corporate governance decision-making for all state-owned businesses, not just the ones which are being defaulted, not just the one or two which are allowed to default. How does it skew corporate governance decision-making? Because critically, all of these businesses now know, even if they weren't in a default, that when they will be in a default in the future, the government will save them. What does that do? First of all, it massively breeds complacency. As a corporate board, you are no longer incentivized in any way to increase productivity and hit quarterly reports and hit quarterly targets, because you know, even if you don't do so, even if that in the future leads, to you falling and not being able to repay your debt, the government will save you. It means that also all of these companies will cut innovation, because why spend money on innovating a product when instead you can funnel that money into dividends for your shareholders and profits for yourself and put them into your garage of Lamborghinis, because you know that actually the government will let you default when time to repay a loan comes, right? All of these companies would do that, not just the one or two from OO. I also want to point out lastly that interestingly, often these corporate boards will now avoid difficult decision making. They will avoid difficult decisions such as restructuring the company when the company is facing economic downturn. The reason they'll do this is because they know they can just shy away from those difficult decisions. They can run away from them, even if they're actually necessary for the survival of the company, because they'll know they'll be supported by the government at the end of the day. All of that breeds, all of the impacts of OO are massively multiplied across the economy, across all businesses, because of the signaling effect which skews corporate governance practices. That has massive negative impacts on Chinese citizens, right, in terms of their products being worse, their innovation falling, but also importantly, right, in terms of the decision-making processes that these companies take and how they won't take difficult decisions. Also, lastly, I want to point out, and this is quite interesting within this argument, that that this is a massive benefit that these companies, state-owned companies, are getting. I think because of this signaling effect of you'll get massive benefits if you're a state-owned company, many private corporations in China, which were previously apprehensive from having government backing, will now come under the umbrella, the large tent of the Chinese Communist Party, and allow the Chinese Communist Party to buy ownership and shareholding within them in order to allow the Chinese Communist Party to control them, because they know this has a massive economic benefit. It has the massive economic benefit of never having to repay a debt in the future. That means companies which up until now would not compromise on their values, for example, not accepting censorship, right, not accepting government meddling, often will now accept it because they know it comes with a massive benefit to them if they do accept that they won't have to repay loans if they become state-owned, right? That's substantially bad for the independence of these companies. Now, second big point I want to make on extension. Recognize that opening opposition says, the banking context of China has issues, right? But they don't really explain where that comes from. They say, it's over leverage. Why is it over leverage? Because of the One Belt, One Road project. The One Belt, One Road project, which has seen China put in massive loans into Kenya, Pakistan, Nigeria, Sri Lanka, across the world, has seen China lose enormous amounts of money. Why? Because they gave out those loans with knowing that they won't be repaid. Knowing that they won't be repaid because they were banking on that, banking on them not being repaid so that they can gain political favors when they tell the country, it's fine, you don't have to repay the loan. When they tell Kenya, it's fine, you don't have to repay our loan, but let us have these sort of political concessions. But in return, they got far less economic benefits than they were expecting. They got some rare earth minerals from time to time, but actually they didn't gain the economic benefits they expected, right? Substantially, that means that they lost a lot from those loans which didn't have to be repaid. That, coupled with over-leveraging their banking system and from having toxic debts from firms they support in these countries, mean that China is already at a tipping point as regards its banking system. Allowing these defaults for these state-owned companies will cause the tipping point, which causes a crash within the Chinese economy because it's already crippled because of the One Belt, One Road overextension. Lastly, my last point I want to make is, if China does this, there will never be any more trust in state bonds, because if they manipulate bonds in this way, the people will not trust the Chinese government in taking on bonds from them and paying the government massive amounts of money for bonds. That is bad, because in the future, China will need a lot of money from its people. No longer can it accrue that money from offering bonds to its people, because no one will accept them. They're a bad investment. You can't rely on the CCP anymore. That cripples China even further economically. For all these reasons, please oppose.
All right, we'd like to thank this speaker for that speech. We're going to give just about 30 seconds before we welcome the government whip.
Sorry, you said I can start, right? Or should I wait?
Yeah, just wait 30 seconds, and then we'll see if a message is in the room chat for you to go ahead. Is that okay? For you?
Yeah. So I'll just wait until the message. Okay.
Extremely sorry for that. I'm back.
Thank you for waiting. All right, great. So you can start whenever you're ready.
Okay, sounds good. Okay. All right, I'm going to start with CO. So the first thing that closing opposition gives you is that there is a signaling effect to state-owned enterprises that are now likely to become more complacent. So a couple responses to this firstly. One, I think there are still massive incentives for these companies to still try and advance themselves, given that they still profit from that kind of success. Notably, state-owned enterprises often don't have the same competitive incentives as other companies because they're state-owned, and they still often seek success. Like, I'm unclear as to that, like, why these people get complacent. The second thing, though, is that this is actually distinctly better economically for these companies, and that is specifically because they are, like, external actors are far more willing to invest in state-owned enterprises. And this is what RR gives you, right? Because when you are less in debt, when you have to show investors that you are not in debt, or at least they know that they don't need to worry about the amount of debt that you're in because they know that you can default, they are far more likely to invest in you. This actually leads to far better outcomes for state-owned enterprises because you get far more global and domestic investment. That's something that opposition was unwilling to engage with. The second thing that CO says is that now that you are less willing to make hard decisions, I actually think this is the exact opposite. I think you are far less risk averse when, again, you know you can default. Like, this is really great for these companies. I think they are definitely going to want to be able to act in different ways and be more strategic when they know that their domestic government is behind them, right? Like, I don't understand why this leads to easier decisions for them. I think they're far more likely to take the risks they need to become successful. Okay, moving on then. Oh, sorry, actually the second thing on. Okay, yeah. The second thing that CO tells you is that there are private companies that will now want to be bought by the CCP. Okay, I'm unclear why this is a bad idea. Like, I think that opposition has asserted to you, perhaps because of a sentence said in the PM, that privatization is always the goal of the CCP. This is not necessarily true. You likely want control over the most profitable companies within your country. If that's a knife, like, I guess I'll take it, but I really don't think that OG was asserting that we always want prioritization. The second thing is, even if it's not good for you that these companies want to become state-controlled, then just don't buy the stock. Like, I don't understand why CO says, oh no, now you are forced to control these companies if you don't want to. Like, if you don't want to control Tencent, then don't buy Tencent stock. I don't understand why that's a concern for you. Finally, on Belt and Road, like, really questionable as to whether that was a failure on the part of the CCP. I think they got massive advantages from that, both in South Asia and in Africa. They literally own so much of Africa now, and I don't know that that was a huge failure for them. But two, I think it actually proves that the Chinese government is able to weather defaults, right? If they were able to take massive loans out for these companies, and then those countries defaulted, like, clearly you are able to weather that. I'm not sure that allowing this for your own domestic companies or your state-owned enterprises meaningfully is a huge signaling effect or massively changes international markets if people already know you as a country that is willing to do this. Next, moving on to, like, these companies as a whole, right? But actually, first I'll take closing.
So you're right that the Chinese Communist Party can weather defaults if they're limited, but when they come from both your international partners and internal partners, and you're manipulating your currency to offset exports with vessel, you're not able to control those, then it becomes overwhelming for the system.
Yeah, so I think that there was a lot more work needed on opposition if their case was not, oh, now you're doing something completely different, that's going to lead to a bad signaling effect, but now they're like, this is the tipping point of the massive amount of actions that you've done in the exact same genre. If they're going to now concede that you've been doing a fuck ton of stuff like this already, and that this is just an addition to a pile of anti-competitive things that the Chinese government was already doing. I have no analysis as to why this is now the tipping point, and now external investors are going to hate you. Like, obviously, they just conceded that you've been doing this before, both in terms of default and in terms of manipulation of your own currency. If that was okay with the international markets, there's been no analysis as to why this is now the point at which international investors are going to be so mad at you. Then moving on to companies and the characterization of that. I think the front half of this debate got really distracted by talking about specifically companies that are bound to fail, specifically like competitors of things like WeChat or Alibaba, right? Like, I get that OO somewhat talked about successful companies, I'll get to that in a second, but I think that a vast majority of the front half debate was about these failing companies. So I think Harar was the first person on Gov to tell you about specifically valuable companies of the CCP, notably in industries such as resource extraction, right? Not only do these bolster state power in terms of the actual economic success that they give you, but they're also massively important to you from an international relations standpoint, right? Because at the point at which you are a key player and your state-owned enterprises are a key player in like global supply chains, specifically through resource extraction, that gives you a lot of political power as well. That means you aren't aiming to privatize these industries, but actually really want to keep control of them. Again, like contesting a lot of the characterization that we always want privatization in these areas. They're also unique in that you often need long-term investment because massive amounts of capital have to go into these industries. Harar tells you this as well, right? The ability to weather economic shocks while you are in a fledgling state of that company is massively advantageous to state-owned firms, and you often want to keep control of them as opposed to having to sell them to private entities. When we tell you that they need to be able to weather shocks, OO's analysis on specifically these good companies is that there are other options that you have to solve that. I'm going to get into that in a long spiel, but I'll let OO POI first.
Even if it was that this brings net to somebody during a crisis, recognize that it also then means that all the banks are going bust because you have a lot of companies defaulting. That then means that you skew the market and you fuck over all the private companies, you lose the jobs. To the extent that you need to help certain companies that are in your strategic interest, why not do it less transparently, via mechanisms that are clearly less unfair and don't push the burden on private entities that means that the private economy gets fucked?
That's a super good point. Like, I'm not sure that a lot of the signaling that opposition is talking to you about is necessarily going to be that harmful, given that you probably don't have to do this transparently, and I don't think the motion forces us to do it transparently. But the second and more important thing is that I'm still unclear as to why this is the tipping point for why banks are now going to massively fail and the Chinese economy is going to crash when you've already been allowing massive amounts of defaults. Like, your back half tells us that this has been happening on a massive scale internationally. It's still unclear, and no opposition team has told me why specifically this is going to lead to a massive failure of banks. But let's talk about the alternatives the opposition wants to bring you, right? Because they say, hey, for the good companies that you want to revive, you don't have to do it through allowing defaults. One, they never prove to you why bailouts are necessarily better. Harar gives you a number of reasons why they're not, notably that loans often mean that A, you get less external investment because these companies have to declare that they have massive amounts of debt that investors don't know that they can repay. But two, it means that you are likely to break your own bank. If you have to give massive loans to these companies, that looks like what happened during 2008 in the US. Like, oftentimes, governments having to bail out these companies directly is actively harmful to the government and the party itself. But secondly, we tell you why domestic bond default is actually more internationally competitive, because as many subsidies as you can give your state-owned firms, that doesn't make you more competitive internationally against, like, for example, industries in Southeast Asia that are trying to compete with you in resource extraction industries, right? When you are able to better internationally compete because you are not allowing international companies to default on their loans that they might have with their government, but allowing those, your own companies to do so, that increases international competition and therefore bolsters your power. I think at the end of the day, like, it gives your companies far more competitive advantage and doesn't necessarily lead to the economic harms that opposition talks to you about, because they never prove why these are unique against the other defaults that you're already weathering. Proud to propose.
We like to thank the speaker for that speech. We invite the opposition whip to conclude this debate. Hear, hear.
Okay, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Cool. So starting in 3, 2, 1. Even if we take closing government at their best, and we are only doing this for enterprises that are going to be highly successful in the future, what Tudor tells you, and the reason why he wins the debate, is because he explains why we compromise for a few industries that could potentially be successful in the future, both the future economic security of the CCP and the ability of them to obtain massive amounts of loans that they require in order to function. And it also compromises a culture that Xi Jinping has fostered since the first purges that he organized, which is work well or you will be removed. two things that I'm going to be talking about. First, on alternatives to deal with the gulf bench mechanisms, and secondly, on why we think that this is horrible for the CCP economically, not just for businesses right now, as OO tells you, but businesses in the future, essentially compromising the entirety of the 50-year plan that the CCP probably has written down somewhere. First then, on alternatives, I want to deal first with OG just to nail the, finalize and explain why we don't think that they're within the debate. What OG tells you is that, we'll allow them to default, and that means that they go under. Importantly, if you allow them to default, they're also not giving you money back. We say we also let them go under, but the difference is we break them up and we force them to pay all the money that they own to a bunch of other people who now have more money that they have the ability to then lend out, that they have the ability to then utilize to pay their employees. So we think that in terms of that way up, we are definitely winning that way off. I want to deal, however, with what closing government tells you. What closing government says is, at the end of the day, it's very bad that you let these companies go under because it potentially creates economic crisis. I want to note that this extension was mostly dropped in WHIP and that there was no response given to what Tudor told you, that there are a lot of viable alternatives that you can utilize to make sure that the economic impact of these companies disappearing is negligible. I'm assuming that those responses still stand. The second thing that closing government tells you is that, it is important that we keep these companies because in the future they will be potentially very, very successful because of things like resources extraction. I want to note that China is mostly an economy that functions on trade, but second, an economy that also runs, at least on a domestic level, on things like agronomic impact and like growing plants, whatever. I'm ESL sometimes. But I think that the important thing to note here is that the impact that you can gain from potential natural resource extraction within China is negligible when you compare it to the impact that you can gain from resource extraction in the entirety of Africa, in the entirety of the Belt and Road scope of power. What Tudor uniquely tells you, and that's the extension that they mock instead of responding to, is that we need state-owned businesses to be money gainers so that we can fund the Belt and Road rather than money spenders so that they take money away from the Belt and Road. We tell you that even if a company could potentially gain us a lot of money within China, it's negligible compared to the amount of the Belt and Road. We need these companies to be efficient. It's fine for them to go under and for them to only make us money. So overall, in terms of alternatives, I think we're winning and beating the gulf bench. Second, though, why do we think that this is bad for the CCP economically? Before I move on, I will take closing. Closing?
Yeah, sorry. Mike was just taking a second. Could you please engage with the fact that as the incentives of the CCP, number one, we've already told you why it's massively harmful to provide mass bailouts en masse, but also why this necessarily undermines the legitimacy if all of your state enterprises go under at once.
I don't want to provide bailouts for them. I want them to go under. And I don't think that all state enterprises are failing. I think the vast majority of them are doing quite well. We just say the ones that are failing should go. Okay, why is this bad for the CCP economically? Which I think we agree is important. I think opening government tells you, state or corporations have an unfair advantage, but there's many things that they will have an advantage, like the fact that they get massive money from the CCP. But I think that the more important thing is that it creates a noxious economic climate. And they have the thing about banks. But I think that what Tudor crucially adds are two things. Firstly, is that it destroys trust in state bonds as the last extension that he gave. And I think that the important thing here is that it isn't just investors right now who don't have money and won't invest in other things, but it is also investors in the future who are way less likely to invest money in state bonds because they think that at any given point, the CCP can say, I'm not going to pay you back. This is uniquely harmful for two reasons, right? Firstly, because the CCP wants state industries to succeed. If you don't get money from private investors, it means that those investors are giving them to other private companies. It means that you as a state have less control over the market. And I think that overall, that means that in your future, you don't have the capacity to run your industries and run them well. But secondly, it's because also it means that you're less likely to be able to get the money that you also need to fund international projects like the Belt and Road Initiative, right? It means that overall, projects that China runs that require insane amounts of investment now so that they can reap a lot of money in the future are now unable to get that initial investment to get off the ground because no one trusts you with their money because you're just too big a risk in case of default. I think that this is the biggest impact that we have gotten in the entire debate. I will take opening government now. OG, go. Okay, I'm just going to continue. OG, you can just start speaking over me. Okay, the second thing that Tudor gives you that I think also wins the debate is he tells you how this creates a culture of failing industries in the future. Right now, the CCP culture is cutthroat. It's one where you are told that you have to succeed or you will be cut. And this completely undermines that. The response that CG gives, I think, is reasonable, which is, but now people have an incentive to, work very hard so that they can show the government that they shouldn't be cut out. I think the problem is that as individuals, we are quite badly placed to analyze whether or not we have done our best or tried our hardest. So what it instead breeds is the idea that, the government has to save me because my industry is important, because my industry could potentially in the future gain a lot of money. But it doesn't matter whether or not I have individually put on the effort, because that's not what the CCP cares about. What the CCP cares about is about whether or not my company in the future could potentially be resource extraction, not whether I individually have put in effort. That's the metric that CG themselves gave you in this debate. It isn't about individual effort. It's about the potential that the company has to make money in the future. And that is not dependent on how well you work. And I think that that's a problem, right? Because the culture is no longer you have to work hard for the industry to succeed, but it is one where, if you're in resource extraction, I guess you're safe. You don't actually need to work that hard. And that's the problem. That's when your state industries become not successful. That's when you create the American, culture of, we're too big to fail. We're Wall Street. We can do what we want. The government doesn't have to let us fail, instead of the Chinese model of efficiency that the CCP wants. I think that that's terrible. At the end of the day, if you take the government at their best, they save a few potentially successful in the future national industries whilst compromising the entire ability of China to obtain money for their industries in the future, the capacity of the Belt and Road to function, precisely because we're giving money instead to state-owned industries, and a culture that the CCP has tried to foster since the beginning. I don't think any of those things are worth the hassle, and that's why I think that you should vote for closing opposition. Thank you.
We'd like to thank